Well, billions is being pumped into economies the world over to try and fix the coronavirus and ensure that economies can bounce back at the end of it. But will it work? And more to the point, who are the real beneficiaries? Will money get to the businesses and people who really need it? Or will we have lots of people in debt at the end, hindering the chance of any sort of rapid recovery? And whether by chance or design, will we also see the financial sector as one of the main beneficiaries of these interventions by governments and central banks? In other words, is it the global financial crisis all over again? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast. And Steve Keen is with me again. I'm Phil Dobbie. So with all the money being splurged on keeping the economies of the world afloat during the coronavirus outbreak, who is it really helping? Look at the global financial crisis, and the people who drove us into trouble there really came out largely unscathed. Take the CEO of Lehman Brothers. He's still working. He's running a wealth fund, but he said that the government was responsible for the Lehman Brothers collapse, for promoting home ownership and giving people access to cheap credit. Nothing to do with him. It was all the government's fault. Now it's not banks collapsing. It's shops and small businesses and big businesses, of course, like airlines as well, with millions of people losing their jobs. So, Steve, is it again going to be a case that Wall Street is supported whilst Main Street or High Street is left to fend for itself? Is it the GFC all over again?
Well, I think that's the danger because, last time, if you look at things like, for example, the TARP, the Travel Asset Recovery Program, I think it was his name, TARP, that was the major initial fund, at least, that the American government threw at the financial crisis. And part of that was supposed to be a scheme for rescuing mortgagees who could no longer pay their mortgages and couldn't do the jingle mail trick. And the number of people who got money out of that scheme was trivial, whereas the money just went pumped into Wall Street in a dramatic way. I know one of the companies was involved in managing that fund. It ended up being not of the order of 4 times as much as $700 billion. And then you had the quantitative easing taking place, and the whole idea of QE was quite deliberately to drive up share prices. Yeah. And that's exactly what happened. They bottomed, I still love the fact that they bottomed, this S&P 500 bottomed at 666 points and then turned around towards 3,000. All on the idea that people would spend out of the wealth effect, when in fact even the research by a little obscure little organisation called the Federal Reserve showed there was no wealth effect out of shares. So it's if anything, wealth effect at all was trivial and out of housing. So yeah, the Wall Street managed to turn the whole thing to its favour, and they got away with it because people were in the streets, but they weren't starving. Yeah. And I think this time around it's going to be different. This time around, yes, they'll try to do exactly the same thing. Yes, they've got the ear of the politicians. Yes, they'll have the spin doctors telling the politicians, a bit like that scene from Blazing Saddles, which I probably can't use the punchline from anymore. But when the sheriff puts a gun against his head and says, "Make a mad move," and the black guy gets it, they can't pull that trick again. So. Yeah, to me, it's going to be much messier than last time round. As last time, it should have been Main Street that was rescued, not Wall Street. But as last time round, Wall Street has the ear of the politicians.
Right, but we can't have banks fail, can we? Because banks have got people's money tied up in it. So we don't want... we want both, don't we? The question is, Are we helping Wall Street and supporting those people who could perhaps do with a little less, rather than necessarily banks falling over entirely?
Yeah, right from the very outset, one of my first posts on the topic was to say we have to provide the cash flow that enables people to meet their financial commitments now. Otherwise, the system will collapse, because I'm not particularly concerned about the credit system right now. I'm concerned about the payment system. But because payments are caught up in the credit system, we all use our bank accounts as the means to transfer money to somebody else's bank account when we go shopping. And also when we pay our rent and pay our mortgage. If we're not getting the inflow, then particularly in America's case, there are tens, if not tens of millions of houses, possibly up to 100 million houses in America, where the owner, or where the renter or the mortgagee can only afford 1 month worth of payments. And once that 1 month is gone, that's it. Now, of course, that means, first of all, they can no longer put food on the table if they prioritise paying their rent or their mortgage. And then 1 month later, they can't even pay their rent or their mortgage. So they fall over first, and then the financial system falls over. We just can't allow that to happen. But
no. And hey, guess what? that's the way most of us live. I couldn't go a few months without paying the mortgage, and in fact, the only reason we've got a bit of a buffer is because my wife got a bit of a bonus a couple of months ago. So we've actually got a buffer that we wouldn't have had a few months ago. We would have been in deep stum if we lost our income coming out of all of this. Because the first thing central banks do is lower interest rates further, if that was possible, down to zero, basically, which is great for governments issuing bonds.
If it mattered.
If it mattered, but I mean, they still think it does. But of course, small businesses don't get that level of access, do they? They don't get 0% interest loans.
They don't even get access to the loans in the first place, and they can't afford to service the loans to begin with. So, yeah, it is one of those cases where the fact that the payment system is tied up with the credit system is a major issue. If you look at countries like Japan, which I think Japan still has the post office bank system, so a large number of Japanese bank through the post office, which is a public entity, and they can make payments from their accounts there. So if there's a collapse in the credit-based bank, it doesn't affect the payments as much in Japan as it does in the rest of the world. But because we're all relying upon commercial banks to make our ordinary payments, if we can't make our ordinary payments, then we collapse first and the banks follow shortly afterwards.
One of the first things, other than dropping interest rates, was also looking at liquidity in the transactions, in banking transactions, in the what are called the repo markets, and they were worried about that last year. So it's not just a coronavirus thing. But the more I look into that is really, the part of the reason why some of that money is disappearing. I mean, the repo markets are basically overnight markets, aren't they? So it's how banks balance out. I need some money because I've got liquidity issues in my bank, but it's only short term. So I'll get some money from another bank overnight, and then we'll sort it out, and we'll pay you back with a bit of interest. With that interest is zero now, because it's basically what determines the interest rate. That's how the repo markets work. But it's not just banks, is it? Because in fact, half the time the banks are not going through these repo agreements. They're just dealing with them themselves. The issue is actually companies like hedge funds that are actually using this short-term low interest repeatedly in a speculative way to fund highly leveraged long-term funding. So in other words, they're getting money on the cheap. So in a way, by the Fed putting money into the repo markets, they're helping these hedge funds, perhaps more than they're helping the real banks. And hedge funds, what do they do for the real economy? The Fed's bailing them out, but what good are they to the real economy? Yeah,
well, I mean, you always try to argue that they help in price discovery, and that's really interesting. They discovered a negative price for oil yesterday. So the whole idea that this is a useful service, I think, is just one of these elements where they pretend that it's the price discovery that matters, when it's really enormous speculative positions where they win extremely well if they're on the right side of the trade, and they can get wiped out on the other. Keynes once made the remark about how if the investment profile of a country is set by the activities of a casino, the job is likely to be all done. Well, that's what we've been doing for the last 30 years.
And we are going to see the finance sector grow out of all of this, aren't we? Obviously, because we are going to see more loans happening. So any hope that this might actually see more of a balance in terms of income disparity, it's going to get worse, isn't it?
I'm not sure. I mean, this is one area where one thing I've been arguing for a modern debt jubilee at least since 2011, and saying that the only way to get out of the crisis is to reduce the private debt levels it caused, and basically give everybody, whether they're a debtor or a saver, a cash injection, which can be used to either pay down debt or get a cash injection to those who didn't have debt in the first place. So there's no bias in favour of the people who gambled and speculated. But I never thought that had a hope in hell of having any chance of happening. And for that reason, I haven't updated the document. I wrote about it since about 2012. But
you now think it could happen?
Yeah, I think it could. I mean, it's certainly happening to some degree, in the sense that, the universal basic income type concepts are turning up, being done half-heartedly, and with
not enough
and too many conditions.
Yeah, exactly.
But being done
and issued by the government issuing bonds, which they are still expected to pay back. So it's not helicopter money. It's just a bond it's got a maturity to it. It might be a long term and it might be low interest. But the expectation is that that's going to be that money is going to be paid back at some point.
Yeah, we still haven't broken out of that mindset that the government has to borrow to have its own money, which is one of the, at least to some extent, what happens during a panic is that the conventional wisdom gets thrown out the window, because the conventional wisdom led to the situation of panic in the first place. That was what happened back in the global financial crisis. And for a short while, you had governments doing sensible things, and then bang, they went back to because the world didn't end on that that day in August in 2007. Then they've gone back to the conventional thinking, and of course the finance sector still dominates that. So I'm afraid these ideas are going to be blocked by the financial sector.
And almost by everybody else as well, because there's a one-word answer. The moment you start talking about, let's not issue bonds that have got a maturity to them, let's just issue money to the government to support its needs and just keep an eye on inflation, which is the only consequence of all of that. There's a one-word answer to all of that, which a lot of people come out with very quickly. Venezuela.
Oh, I was going to Zimbabwe. Damn, I got the wrong
Zimbabwe.
one. Yeah, okay. It's down that into the... I mean, the fact that people can effectively say, look, this person's had a heart attack, and the last thing we want to do is support their heart, because if we support their heart now, they'll want to have a ventilator at all times and they walk around the street. I mean, give me a break. It is insanely stupid to apply that thinking, but that won't stop it being applied.
Yeah. So we're not going to see that happen, are we, this time around? Or do you think if this thing goes on for a long time and governments are racking up more and more debt, at some point they're going to say, well, look, we're never going to be able to pay this back. And do we have to worry about inflation? Do we have to worry about inflation, for example, when oil is worth minus $40?
Yeah, I mean, this again, one of the posts on the Patreon site is saying, do we face inflation or deflation? And my vote has always been with deflation, because, again, the reason this is so much more serious a crisis than it could have been is because we accumulated all this private debt in the run-up to the global financial crisis, did not eliminate it, and now all the debtors are incredibly financially fragile. So as soon as their cash flow stops, so does their capacity to service that debt, and then the financial sector falls over as well. Now, that's obvious to me. It's obvious to anybody who listens to this podcast, but it's not even in the brains of the economists that are advising the politicians, and most of the politicians themselves who are obsessing about government debt. So in some ways, it's incredibly frustrating. It's like watching somebody, crash a car by turning the wheel the wrong way around a roundabout. You know what to do, but you're stuck in the passenger seat.
And yet the approach for the non-government sector is largely loans, isn't it? We are seeing some government money to try and help furloughed workers, but as you say, not enough. It's basically minimum wage, and most, guess what? Most people aren't on minimum wage, but they still have mortgages to pay and all that sort of stuff. But on top of that, then we get loans as well. So there's the payroll protection program, which is in the United States, low-cost loans to companies of less than 500 people for keeping their employees on their books. So that's the way they're doing it in the US. In Australia and the UK, we are basically saying, yep, here's the money. It's 80% in the case of the UK of the lowest wage, I think. In the US, they're saying, yep, it's going to be a loan managed by the Small Business Administration. It's going to be issued through the banks, totaling $349 billion. That's already been spent, though, and there's expected to be more to come, another $250 billion. So that's good in a way, in that those businesses are keeping operating. But of course, they're coming out the other side they're going to have hefty debt as a result of all of this.
Yeah, I mean, you just look at it and you think this is the initial problem you don't know is there, and your solution is going to make it worse when we come out the other side. So to me, it's setting up, if we do finally find a way of taming the coronavirus, and that's still a very big if, then on the other side, people will say everything's back to normal, and crash, we go into a financial crisis, because most of the economy won't be able to service the financial commitments they've taken on both before and during the crisis.
Yeah, I'm hearing that in a few places. The idea of a double dip recession, or a recession and a double dip depression, maybe.
Yeah, like the people are talking about a V-shaped recovery. I think that particular letter's gone out of the out of the dictionary. But a W-shaped one is quite likely in the sense that you go down, really down, think you've come back out of it, and then suddenly find that your financial sector crashes as well in the aftermath to it. So I do think we're going to have a health fire crisis followed by a financial crisis. And
well, we are just pushing the problem back, aren't we? I mean, that idea in the US, which is open to abuse. I'll come back to that in a second, because there's the other factor in all of this. We're making it so complicated it's open to abuse. But in Australia, allowing people to access their super funds, their retirement money, to get them through. You can take out 10,000 before July. You can take another 10,000 out before September. So that's 20 grand. The average person aged 35 to 44 in Australia has got a super balance. For men, it's 100,000. For women, it's less than 70,000. So you could be losing up to 28% of your super. Not the rich, of course. They've got balances in the millions, but and they're not going to care about losing 20,000. But that becomes a real issue for people if they've lost a whole chunk of their super money to try and get them over this hurdle. They're going to have to then save up more for their retirement, which is money that's not going to go into the economy in the interim.
Yeah, and I think also people are realising that they've been led into a position of incredible fragility by all this financial engineering that's supposed to make their lives more secure for the future. So I think a level of anger is going to rise out of all this, and it'll be more anger than we saw after the global financial crisis. At that stage, people, to some extent, were blaming themselves. So if you're taking out a loan, there they were, ma and pa, kettle, with no academic training behind them, and they made the mistake of accepting an offer from a bank which has 1,000 PhDs in economics advising it, and they blame themselves for making a bad decision. That isn't going to happen this time round. People are going to say, I didn't choose to cause the coronavirus. I didn't choose to delay for 5 weeks when the whole thing went through. I didn't even choose the lockdown. And in that situation, I think anger is going to be much more of an emotion at this time than it was last time.
Well, and the problem with that as well is if you're not giving the people the money that they need to survive, then they do get angry. And as we're seeing that in parts of the United States, like in Michigan, for example, where people are just saying, no, we want to get back to work. And they're ignoring social distancing. They're saying this is an imposition on our freedom. We want to start earning until we die, of course.
This is one of the horrors of this whole situation. The virus couldn't give a damn about whether you're a libertarian or a Marxist, so long as you're a host and you're within reach of another. A Marxist can give it to a libertarian and vice versa. So the odds are that this is going to expose how fragile our ideologies are as well, and how we've designed a social system with complete disregard for the biological system that this social system is inherently a subset of. And this to me is what is terrifying about all this. We really did set ourselves up to make this as bad as possible. Globalised production, a massive emphasis upon transportation and travelling goods and services around the world. Even how we behave in public transport, which I normally favour. Public transport is a great way to spread this virus. So, all sorts of dilemmas. And we're going to... It is really the one thing I can say it's doing for us is making us realise that biology rules everything on this planet, and we have been ignoring that for far too long. And it's about damn time we took it seriously.
Yeah, I wonder whether we will at the end of that. And look, next week I want to talk a little bit more about, what are we returning to? Is it going to be normal ever again, or is it, what's our future hold for us? But just looking at, the way we've dealt with just the economy around the world, I'm just wondering if we're making it more complicated. Obviously, the people who listen to this podcast regularly will be saying, well, okay, helicopter money going to everybody so that they can get through. And who cares whether some people get money that they don't, open inverted commas, deserve, close inverted, so long as everyone's got some money to keep the economy afloat so that they can buy food, pay whether it's their mortgage or their rent, just enough money, and therefore come out the other end with enough money to spend. And who cares if some people come out of it better off than they went in? That's good. If other people are slightly worse off, but they've still survived, that's good. The economy can kick up again. But we're not doing that, are we? We're talking about minimum amounts of money going to people who meet very specific criteria. Smart to get it through businesses because there's an easy distribution mechanism. Pay your employees and keep them employed. That makes perfect sense. but a lot of it is saying, take out a loan. So in the UK, for example, there is a scheme where you can borrow money through banks, but the same as in the US. But in the UK, it's not happening because the banks still have to carry 20% of the liability, and obviously they're not going to do that because banks never loan to small businesses anyway at the best of times, and they're certainly not going to start now.
Yeah, I know. It is just so irritating to watch this from the outside and see people who've never understood money and haven't understood biology either, managing a biological crisis which is destroying the monetary system, and just, at least they're doing some things correct. One thing can be said in favour of panic. When you panic, you forget everything that you thought was unnecessary. Or rather, you thought was necessary before you got into a situation of panic, and then that's where things like a cut-down version of UBI, etc., has come in. But again, they go back and do all this crazy stuff of saying, let's put conditions on this, let's slow down how fast the money gets out there, let's make it less than people need, etc., etc. That's great. Let's if somebody's fallen overboard, let's keep them 6 inches below seawater level rather than letting them fall 2 meters.
Yeah. Well, look, 140,000 companies applied for the furloughed workers scheme the beginning of this week in the UK. In one day, actually, it accounts to basically 1 million people. But the government is going to pay 80% of the salary for those companies to keep those people on their books for £2,500 pounds per worker per month. So that's a start. It's going to cost £1 billion. They could do a lot more, couldn't they?
They could do £1 billion. Is that all?
Yeah, that's all. Yeah, I mean, and yet we're talking trillions in terms of managing liquidity through central banks. £1
or £2 trillion economy. I mean, again, the frustration is knowing this could all be done with simple accounting, because this is the one fascinating aspect of the British financial system is that the Scottish banks put out Scottish pound notes, which are legal tender both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK, and they're backed by a piece of paper called a Titan, which has a face value of £100 million and sits in a vault in the Bank of England, and that's simply an accounting exercise. The same thing could be done here. They could use Titans to create all the money they need, and it is effectively, it's a life support system when otherwise the system will die. And again, the failure to make a biological analogy is leading us into a biological and financial crisis.
And the only argument against that is that if you create too much money, you get inflation. You keep on getting back to that, don't you? For which is just a null argument right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's, they're actually trying to cause inflation, for God's sake, and failing to do that. So it is this bogeyman. We're still fighting not the last war, but the last war before the last war. And there has been some increase in people's awareness about the idea of modern monetary theory and how that money is basically an accounting operation for the government and the banks, and that there's awareness there of that. But it still hasn't seeped through to policymakers, and we're still getting these half-hearted attempts to make things better, which of course are making the system less effective. So, inevitably, lots of companies will come out of this with more debt. I mean, that stands to reason. Even if you're getting the government helping pay the salaries of your workers, if you're not selling anything but you've still got overheads, you're going to come out with more debt at the end of this. You'd be quite happy for a bit of inflation if you're carrying debt. Yeah, I mean, one of the ways you can look at inflation, it's a form of demurrage. Money has three. If you talk about money as a unit of account, a store of value, and a means of payment. Now, one thing which Gazelle realised a long time ago, and Keynes agreed with him, is that the two roles of a store of value and a means of payment are in conflict with each other. Because if you try to keep it as a store of value, it means you spend it less rapidly, and therefore the money you have generates less demand than it does if you treat it as a means of payment. So Gazelle's idea was to put a demurrage on the money so that the longer you held it, the more it declined in value, which was therefore an encouragement to spend. And we need some sort of system that enables that to happen, that you don't have the two functions, the two primary functions of money above the unit of account conflicting with each other. But we've let them conflict for the last 30, 40 years, and now we're in a situation where we've relied upon a continuous injection of new credit to keep the system going, which has got us to the point of a massive credit and debt overhang. And, we just have to reset the system and get, if we could start from the outset, I'd actually build in demurrage is an automatic part of a monetary system, which is equivalent to having a rate of inflation.
So we started to take this whole thing seriously in the middle of March. We're now at the middle of April, just about, and already we're starting to see corporate collapses. So even though we've got furloughed workers schemes, that's not going to work for the 10,000 people who work for Virgin Australia and the 6,000 people allegedly supporting them in support industry. So 16,000 people in Australia aren't being furloughed. They're just not making any money whatsoever. So they're basically on the dole. And, there's lots of talks about, well, should we bail out these companies like in the UK, Virgin Atlantic? Should they be bailed out? Should we be helping the airlines? What do we do for companies that are facing corporate collapse in these circumstances?
We should have been providing cash flow to their workers, but we're not doing that. So I can see attempts to bail these companies out, even though they've one thing they've been doing, particularly Virgin being a classic instance of this, they haven't been paying taxes to begin with, and they want to be bailed out by a state they haven't been supporting, or they've been ripping off in the sense of accumulating the money the government creates while the rest of us have to hand it back. So again, I expect that that's what the governments will do. They'll bail the companies out while still leaving the small actors, the small firms, and the workers in the lurch. And I think, again, I can't see anything other than social conflict coming out of this in the long term.
Well, I think United Airlines has sold a whole load of their aircraft to a Chinese bank, and then they're leasing them back, which is a sensible way of getting cash flow, isn't it? But if you look at Virgin Atlantic, 49% owned by Delta. Last year, Delta bought back over $2 billion worth of shares, and they want a £500 million payout package from the UK government. They would have had plenty of cash if they hadn't bought back those shares. So surely a handout is not needed. They should just be saying, right, okay, share issuance, however many you need, issue those shares, we'll buy them back, the government buys them back, and then we'll sell them again when they're worth a bit more.
Yeah. That's what we should do.
In nationalisation, basically.
Fundamentally, nationalisation should be part of it, but that's just not going to happen, I think, I'm afraid.
Why is that? I don't understand why not. I mean, we did it with the banks in the global financial crisis. Why wouldn't we do it with other companies? We didn't really do it with the banks.
Right? We bailed them out on their own terms.
Well, but in the UK, Royal Bank of Scotland, for example, came under state ownership.
A very wimpy version. And well, what's the long-term share position for the government there? I think they've handed it back, haven't they?
I made a loss out of it. Absolutely. Yeah.
So again, ideology is leading us astray, and I just, you hope that there'd be a sensible decision made, but as one of I think Mike, one of the patrons, makes the point all the time, you can't expect people who've been trained in the wrong techniques of war to use the right ones in this situation, or do the wrong ones again. And you've just got to basically get rid of the ones in charge and put people in charge who understand the system as it actually functions rather than the ideology. But that's not going to happen.
So we need to change a government. Well, I mean, we need to change a government.
Change of bureaucrats.
Okay, well that might be easier, but unfortunately they're going to keep their jobs, aren't they? And obviously businesses also go through all of this is going to call for less regulation as well. We're hearing that a great deal, which obviously less regulation equals, in other words, lower wages. To get us through this, we need to be able to make bigger profits. That means we need to get away with all those hard fought gains from the workers. We need to be able to screw them to the ground and make more profit.
Yeah, which is the opposite of what we need. Inequality has been pushed far too far in the direction of the financial sector against the workers, and we need to go the balance in the opposite direction. So again, to me, this comes across as the revolt of the peasants, not the king doing the right thing by the peasantry.
But will we see a revolt of the peasants, or will we just see, like we did last time, the finance sector wins, we have more borrowing, the finance sector grows as a result of that, we do see less regulation, therefore we see one sector of society growing, the banks and people who are guarding our cash and lending it out, and other people getting paid less, which means obviously greater inequality. Is that going to be the upshot? Part of me thinks it probably is.
I think most likely yes. Unfortunately, yes, I think it is. And the question is, we're all sort of assuming there'll be a life after the coronavirus. I think life after the coronavirus is going to have another element of this nature coming our way. Remember, for Australia and California, at least, it was preceded by enormous fires. We're seeing the conditions for those fires building up in California yet again right now. This is the new normal of the climate breakdown of the climatic system affecting the economy, and there was no way that the Dark Ages started in a peaceable fashion with the Roman administrators deciding to shut the empire down. It fell apart. And I've got a feeling we're seeing something similar this time around.
And we're not going to be that well prepared to deal with it, because we are going to be, first of all, very divided in terms of income, but we are also going to be going through a pretty long recession from all of this, aren't we? Certainly a period of stagflation, because there's going to be, or stagnation, I should say. There's going to be no growth out of all this, because we're still going to be heaped in even more debt.
Yeah, and that's the trouble. If they expect normal behaviour on the other side of this, when the credit system gets smashed and when people have accumulated more debt that they haven't used for speculative gain, but it's been debt that's been used simply for survival, then servicing that extra debt will mean they're not going to take on any more credit. At that stage, you'll have negative credit in the aftermath of this crisis rather than positive, and bang, we're back on a financial crisis once more.
But isn't that the point at which people start to go, hang on a second, why are we not getting any growth out of all of this? Why is there no V-shaped or U-shaped or even W-shaped curve? It's just an L-shaped curve. At some point, someone's going to go, well, how do we get out of this? We've got to heap money on it, and a debt, that Steve Keen was talking about debt jubilees. Maybe we should listen to that guy.
Let's ever see. I mean, I'm still worried about the complete social breakdown coming out of this one, not a more sensible change from people who don't understand the system than those that do. We've got to jump across from Ptolemy to Copernicus in one go and get the Ptolemaic astronomers to understand that the Earth is not the centre of the universe. That just doesn't happen.
Well, at least we understand that. That much we do understand, but perhaps that's where our sphere of learning stopped. Good to talk, Steve. Look, next time we will look at what happens next. What is the new normal? So a chance to expand on some of that thinking.
Yeah.
See you soon.
Okay, Matt.
And you know what? Before that, we might also squeeze in the podcast, which has been sitting around for a while, unpublished. Steve and I talking about the collective works of Adam Smith. What can we take out from Adam Smith's collective works, if anything at all? So we'll do that next time, and then back in a week also talking about the coronavirus. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. This is the Debunking Economics podcast. Subscribe, and you can get access to all of these. There's a couple of hundred of them. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for listening.